Paul warned us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, the cosmic forces of wickedness. Is that how we're acting right now in the USA or in other nations? Or are most citizens of these countries acting like they're opposed by flesh and blood humans, media moguls, and politicians? So how should we be acting to overcome these forces that really are the ones opposing us? That's what we're talking about today, and we're starting right now. Knowing and understanding the game plan of those who oppose you is the key. If you're playing a football game, for instance, American football, but instead of blocking and tackling the other team, you're blocking and tackling their cheerleaders, you will not win that game. And the Apostle Paul is very clear about who our enemy is, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers, over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. So our enemies are not Democrats or Republicans or communists or even globalists. Those characters might take orders from the enemy, but they are victims of the enemy, not the true enemy. They are the enemy's cheerleaders, so to speak, and if we think we are to oppose the cheerleaders, we will not win. So let's begin to look at the demonic forces of wickedness that Paul gives us in this passage. We see that they are in heavenly places, that they are ruling from heaven. That implies that God has given them the authority that they have, at least temporarily. So let's keep that in mind as we proceed. Let's see what we can learn from each group, and then we'll apply what we learn in how to overcome them. This very first group that we see are called rulers. In the Greek, this word is archon, a word derived from the word beginning, like in the beginning. These are the preeminent divine beings. In some places, the Bible translates this word as principalities. So they are the princes. Michael is known as the great prince of your people in Daniel 12:1. Michael is this type of ruler being. So some of these principalities or rulers are good ones, like Michael. And as we see in Ephesians, many are bad. We also see that they are associated with groups of people. Michael is the great ruler prince of the Jewish people. In Daniel 10, we learn about two other ruler principalities, the prince of Persia, which is currently Iran, and the prince of Yavon, which is currently Turkey. These rulers oppose Michael, so we know they are evil archon, or evil principalities. Does the USA have an archon? Does Europe? I'd say almost assuredly they do. Satan himself is given this type of title as well. And you were dead in your offenses and sins in which you previously walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince, which is the word archon, of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. And as you see, it is that spirit working in those humans, the ones we think are opposing us, but it is Satan's spirit controlling them. And Satan is the prince of all demons. Beelzebub, the ruler archon of the demons. So there is definitely a hierarchy of demonic forces, Satan being in charge, and these other archons, the princes of Persia, Yavon, and other people groups, coming next. These princes seem to control a certain domain. This word is used in this way in the Epistle of Jude. And angels who do not keep their own domain or archen, but abandon their proper dwelling place, these he has kept in eternal restraints under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Fallen angels were to keep their own domain. Likely it was controlled by an archon controlled by an archon. So how did these princes or archon gain control of a territories or domains? Other words in the Bible that are used for this group are also Elohim or sons of God. And we see these groups gaining power in Deuteronomy, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. This says when God divided mankind at the Tower of Babel, he allotted the people groups according to the number of the sons of God, or princes, or archon. There were 70 nations, so this kind of tells us that there were 70 of these sons of God, or archon. And God kept Israel for his own possession, the 71st nation. Now, your translation might not say sons of God. It actually might say sons of Israel. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed, we learned the original ancient text of Deuteronomy originally said sons of God. A scribal error or a change somewhere in the last 2,000 years may have caused some English translations to say something else. But sons of God is the likely proper ancient text that Jesus and the disciples knew, and it was speaking of divine beings who were given authority. Now God plans to judge these archon for not administering the nations justly. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, or Elohim, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Here, the archon are referred to as gods, with a little g, but we know there is only one true God. These are divine beings who God created, who are the princes of the nations. The biblical evidence tells us that these created angelic beings were given their authority by their Creator. They were meant to serve under God and facilitate his purposes for a well-ordered world. Their delegated role, however, was misdirected, particularly when they began to accept the idolatrous worship of humans. They became powerful forces for evil, instead ruining God's good creation. And later, in this psalm, God tells us he will eventually judge them and kill them as if they were human beings. That is their ultimate fate. Isaiah speaks of their judgment day as well. On that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven, and that's the archon, in heaven, and the kings of the earth on the earth. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison. The next level of demonic power beneath the princes or archon in this heavenly demonic hierarchy of forces are the authorities. They also appear in another list of creatures that Paul gives us. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Peter tells us that these are separate from the angels, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers, having been subjected to him. So the authorities and powers seem to be separate from angels. And they are far from all-knowing. In fact, the church educates them. Through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers, archon, and authorities in the heavenly places. This hints at some ways into the methods that we can use to overcome them. Looks like education might be part of it. And defeating them requires a new identification and action. One type, while they're still in heavenly places, and most important of all, they're defeated already. He disarmed the rulers and authorities, that's the archon and the authorities, and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in it, the cross. The powers have met their match. Their defeat is not yet final, but the decisive blow has already been dealt to them at the cross. So these powers operate at the highest levels of society, in institutions, economic systems, and government. Paul writes that the God of this age has blinded the minds of all who worship what is not God. Humans are blind to the forces controlling the nations. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated. And there was no longer any place for them in heaven, and the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. That would include the archon and the powers and the authorities. Now we know about them, we need to concentrate on how we defeat them. Paul gives us the outline on how to do this, although it sounds familiar and trite, but it is super important. We are to put on the full armor of God, and it's not at all as simple or trite as you might think. Let's look at the passage. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints. Now you might ask, Nelson, what in the world does this have to do with the USA or other nations? Everything. It has everything to do with it. These are the things that overcome the principalities: truth, righteousness, the gospel, faith, salvation, prayer, and the word of God. That means that the opposite things might strengthen these demons. If you're wondering why the forces of darkness in the nations seem to be growing stronger, it's because of lies, sin, and a lack of the gospel. Does your individual righteousness count in what happens in your nation? Yes, it absolutely does. Even the smallest sins, even the smallest acts of love. Does your reading of the word count? Your prayer? Yes, yes, and yes. And especially your sharing of the gospel. Every soul saved shifts the balance of power. So if you oppose abortion, for instance, voting is important. Protesting is okay. It does get out the truth, but not nearly as important, in my opinion, as your personal righteousness, spreading the gospel, and prayer. Just like the Berlin Wall fell without a shot, the abortion laws will fall as well if the people of God wear the armor of God. Those things may not be directly related in what we see on earth, but they're having an enormous impact on weakening the strongholds that are holding on to those laws in heavenly places. Also, Jesus told us to pray for our enemies. When was the last time you prayed for Anthony Fauci or Bill Gates or even AOC? Spiritual warfare is stronger than most Christians give it credit. The next time you decide to not watch a movie you shouldn't watch, or choose to not gossip about someone, you are chipping away at the power structure of the principalities. But the times that you give in and do things you shouldn't, you're strengthening them. Think about that. But what about when Satan and his demons are physically on the earth? What happens then? Click right here to keep watching and learn about that titanic struggle between Michael and Satan and what might be the most important event during the Great Tribulation, the casting down of Satan himself. This is Nelson, and I'll see you there.